Robertson.
Mr Speaker, it's fascinating to hear that member end on the topic of the importance of supporting science and innovation in New Zealand, and no one on this side of the House would disagree with that. But if we actually go to what the Prime Minister's statement says about the subject of science and innovation, it says, "Science and innovation are therefore key elements of the government's economic agenda, both this year and into the future." Sounds good. But we read a little further down. As I indicated earlier, the fiscal situation means that future new spending allowances can only be very modest, and most agencies will miss out on funding increases altogether. So there we go. We think it's important, we think it's going to contribute to growing our economy, but we don't want to fund it. Mr Speaker, that is typical of this speech that we are talking about today, the Prime Minister's statement, because some people have criticised the Labour Party for suggesting that the speech was perhaps both timid and dangerous. Kind of the danger mouse speech given by the Prime Minister. But the reality, Mr Speaker, is that it is both timid and dangerous. Because what we have is a government forced by electoral imperatives to adopt a vast range of popular Labour policies, but bridling against it. Because John Hayes doesn't really support working for families. He doesn't really support 20 hours free early childhood education. He doesn't really support interest-free student loans. But he knows they had to do it. They had to do it to get elected. And their desire is there. The desire is there to reward their mates, to get back to trickle-down economics, because that worked really well, didn't it? Get back to that. Privatisation, reduce the size of the state. That's what they really want to do. And so what we saw in the Prime Minister's statement was the bridling against that. Bill wasn't happy though, was he? Bill English wasn't happy. It took him a long time to get up in the debate. And when he finally did, he kept saying, well, we're just considering it. We're not quite sure whether we're going to go through with this. It was a timid speech, but what underlay it was a dangerous agenda to take New Zealand down a path where we do only look after the few and not the many. And Mr Speaker, it is a dangerous path to be going down when we look at a situation where a tax cut change could deliver $500 a week to the Prime Minister and only 30-odd cents to somebody on the minimum wage. That is a very dangerous path for New Zealand to go down, because that is a recipe for inequity in our society, for instability in our society, and not a path that the Labour Party favours going down. But, Mr Speaker, it's been a difficult time for the government since they delivered the speech. Things have got very, very messy in terms of some of the key elements. GST. We're not certain where the Prime Minister stands on GST. The one thing we do know is that before the election, the Prime Minister ruled out an increase to GST. Now he's not so sure. Now he's contemplating an increase to 15% for GST, but only if the Māori Party agree to it, although that position appeared to change during this week as well. The same with whānau ora. We began the time after the speech believing that whānau ora was only for Māori. Tariana Turia had developed it. We understand, in fact, that it was going to be funded through Te Puni Kokiri, so that's fine. It was only going to be there. That was the Māori Party's clear position. Suddenly, John Key says, no, it's for everybody. It's for everybody, and it's also a waterbed. It's both of those things. It's for everybody, and it's also a waterbed. A master of the English language there. So total confusion about whānau ora, total confusion about GST. My colleague Darren Hughes has already talked about foreshore and seabed. Complete confusion about what's happening on foreshore and seabed. This is a very, very messy coalition arrangement, and the Prime Minister is reduced to being some kind of deranged ambulance driver running around trying to pick up all the casualties of his coalition, trying to hold it all together, and as a result there is no clear plan emerging from this. All we see emerging from this is a government grappling with itself, grappling with the fact that what it really wants to do is move further down that direction of privatisation, of rewarding their friends, but knowing that they can't do that because they won't get re-elected. That's the tension. That's the danger mouse speech of the Prime Minister, coming through with a speech that does not deliver a plan because he can't quite manage to do it. Mr Speaker, a key element of the government's agenda is supposedly to get us better public services. Now, all New Zealanders want to see better public services. The Labour Party certainly wants to see public services adapt and change, look like the 21st century public services we want them to be, and we made some good advances in that in our first term in government, but there's much more to do. But the National Party's vision for public services is simply not going to deliver those improved public services. In their first year in government, they said that the message was, we want to do more with less. Well, the problem is they're now doing less with less. What they've actually managed to do is cut indiscriminately across the public sector. They managed to cut into institutions like Child, Youth and Family, Ministry of Social Development, the places that are under even more pressure now as we come out of the recession. They are the places that they've cut. And they have a policy that's based on a complete fabrication, Mr Speaker. It's based on a fabrication about something called frontline and backroom services. Now, in the select committee process we've just been through for the estimates, we managed to ask most of the agencies what were frontline services. And we managed to get almost every agency to deliver us a different definition of what frontline services are. Some people said they'd been told by the State Services Commission what they were. Some people said the State Services Commission didn't have a definition. Archives New Zealand is an institution that I personally am very proud of, but I don't quite agree with them when they say that 80% of their staff are frontline workers. I'm struggling to work out how 80%. I think Maurice Williamson probably wouldn't agree that 80% of the archive staff are frontline workers. But this is the problem when we set up artificial definitions. But that's the cornerstone of National's policy. And of course the reality is that if we start making arbitrary distinctions like that in institutions, say like the health board, the district health boards, that's where we start to get in trouble, and we've already seen it with administrative staff being laid off in district health boards, and that will mean one thing, Mr Speaker: doctors and nurses spending less time with patients and more time filling in forms and doing administrative work. Making artificial distinctions between the front line and the back room will simply not deliver better services for New Zealand. Mr Speaker, I hate to say this, but morale in the public service in New Zealand is very low at the moment. And that's because people are having to do 2 and 3 people's jobs. They're under huge pressure. They've been told by this government in this speech that there will be no new funding for 5 years in many of these departments. 5 years. And at the same time, the government's saying, but we also want you to innovate. We also want you to be an innovative public service, taking on new technology, looking at different ways of doing things. Well, Mr Speaker, that is proving impossible for people covering for their mates who have lost their jobs and having to do more and more work with less resources around for them. Mr Speaker, it is simply not on to suddenly say, snap the fingers, the public service will be better. We have to invest in public services. We have to invest in public servants to ensure that they can deliver that 21st century public service we all want. Mr Speaker, the other point I want to make on public services is that this is the year in which teachers and nurses, primary school teachers and nurses, will renegotiate their contracts. And I think the government needs to tread very carefully here. If it's saying that there's no new money for 5 years, if it's saying that to those people, we're already seeing industrial action in places like the Ministry of Justice with court staff. IRD's not far away from the same thing. We're going to have major problems in this country, major disruption, if the government isn't prepared to invest in public services, invest in the teachers and the nurses, and make sure that they have good rates of pay. That is a major problem for this government coming ahead, and I don't see anything in this speech that would actually enable us to believe that they actually want to invest in public services. Mr Speaker, what we have seen in this speech from the Prime Minister is a recipe for increasing unfairness. It's Robin Hood in reverse. It's taking from the poor and giving to the rich. That is what we are seeing in this speech. Mr Speaker, I do want to end, though, on something positive about what Labor is doing at the moment. Labor is working through its policy process at the moment, and the important thing for Labor at the moment is to work out how we can take this country forward with a sustainable economy. And time again, I hear from colleagues in the National Party over there telling us that the economy and the environment are two separate things. Well, Mr Speaker, if this country is to go forward prosperously, we need to ensure that the economy and the environment are considered together. And to find in this speech a section called Unlocking Resources, which is actually code for mining our national parks, is ridiculous. If we cannot bring together the economy and the environment, New Zealand has no future. We need to ensure that we invest in people, we support children in the early years of their lives, and then we get people educated, we give them the skills to contribute, and then we will have a productive economy. Unfortunately, Mr Speaker, there is none of that in the Prime Minister's statement.
Call the member for Kaikoura, Colin King.
Thank you, Mr